So thank you very much to our three very esteemed panelists who are going to be helping us parse through some of the regulatory, ethics, and safety issues. And part of my job as the medical deputy of the Healthspan XPRIZE competition is to oversee some of these. So I'd just like to have each of you introduce yourself. And Zan, I'll start with you.
Zan Flemming. Zan is short for Alexander, but do call me Zan. I'm an endocrinologist by background. I was at NIH before asking to come help out at FDA for a short period of time, but I found I was better at critiquing other people's data than generating them myself, so I made it a career at FDA. My first approval was the first statin. I approved metformin, which at that time was controversial, and other important events at FDA I was fortunate to be involved with. I represented the agency at multiple international fora where I got to know people like Bart. And I was assigned to WHO in Geneva for a year and a half. But over the past 10 years, I've been involved in helping therapeutic development by providing clinical and regulatory strategy. And over the past 10 years, my passion has been not to treat disease, but to prevent it and to slow the aging process. With my colleague Thomas Sir, we founded the Catalyst Institute, which is attempting to improve the ecology around targeting healthy longevity. We also put on a conference in which many of you have participated, and we'll hope to have more of you in the coming events.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'll pass it on to Alberto.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alberto Aparicio. I'm currently an assistant professor in the Department of Bioethics and Health Humanities, the University of Texas Medical Branch. My trajectory is not as extensive as Zan's, but it should suffice to say that I'm broadly interested in the governance of biotechnology and responsible research and innovation. I have conducted research in many different fields, including genome editing, synthetic biology, and the bioeconomy more generally. And at the moment, I focus on longevity biotechnology and neuroscience as a whole in terms of its ethical, social, and political dimensions. Thank you.
Great. And then Bart.
Yes. So, I'm Bart van der Schueren. I'm also an endocrinologist at the University of Leuven in Belgium, where I run an obesity clinic. But I have, for a long time, been active within the European Medicine Agency. I was the Belgian member at the Committee for Human Medicinal Products, so the committee that approves drugs for the European market. And then from on 2024, I'm now inside of the European Medicine Agency, so to say, and I'm an expert at the Office for Cardiovascular Diseases and Endocrine Diseases. And I think you all know that endocrine diseases and aging are very related, so I think I'm also a fan of more preventative medicine and of more graceful aging, so to say.
Wonderful. And I do have some questions from our public comment period that we had in the earlier part of this year, but I'd like to start out with actually having each of you kind of choose a key component that you think we are going to have to address through our Healthspan competition that is in your area of expertise. So Bart, why don't we start with you?
In terms of regulatory, you mean, or?
Yes, whatever you feel is the most.
Yeah, so I think one of the convoluted things within the European space is that the regulatory is a bit scattered in terms of medicinal products, food supplements, and the medical devices. So it's very difficult, it's very necessary to choose the proper path of regulatory approval. And in the case that you're looking at efficacy, it's pretty clear that, and this is not because I'm a part of the European Medicine Agency, but that part should be the European Medicine Agency, and that you should primarily focus on their guidelines and interactions with them when improving a medicinal product. And I think what you're looking for in this setting is a medicinal product which has both efficacy and good safety.
How does the EMA handle supplements? Is it different from what we do at the FDA, which is basically ignore them?
Well, it's a bit in the word Food and Drug Administration, so they also do the food part, whereas European Medicines Agency, they only do the medicinal part. It's sometimes difficult to make the distinction between both, and I think the ones who made the regulations at the time might be knocking their heads now that they didn't put it in one agency, but it's different agencies, and the food is with the EFSA, which is the European Food Association.
Okay, great. And Alberto, what would you say is the key?
Thank you.
problem?
Well, we have already talked about today about the safety issues and avoiding therapies that can present risks to subjects. But I'm concerned in particular about the issues of promises and expectations when it comes to recruitment of patients. And I think there's the possibility that participants may have the wrong impression about this changing their lives, this being able to rejuvenate them or bringing benefits that are not going to be achievable. So maintaining expectations into what's feasible, what's real, and that translates also to managing the public image of the field as something that is based on science and that is based on what's actually possible.
Yeah, I think the public image is something that we would be good to talk about more in a little bit, but that's great. And Zan, what would you choose?
Well, I think the big problem that we all know well, and in effect we've been talking about for most of the day, is that we do not have surrogate endpoints or biomarkers that could be accepted for regulatory approval. Take the statins, for example. We approved the first statin on the basis of about 600 people in 3 to 6 month trials. And within 4 or 5 years, there were cardiovascular outcome trials that led to the first primary prevention indication for CV, for statins. So that went very quickly. If we had such an endpoint, then we would not have to be talking about the different functional endpoints that XPRIZE is focusing on. That is the reality, that FDA and EMA is going to want endpoints that reflect field function or survival benefits.
All right, and that actually kind of segues into one of the questions that I was going to ask each of you as well, which is how can we incentivize research into doing the more preventive aspects with the biochemical changes that lead to the dysfunction? So I think there are some risk-benefit things that we have to consider, but how do we do this, incentivizing the research into it, like you said? Are we doing the right thing with our XPRIZE?
Well, I think that is a great thing to be doing. And I do believe there are things that can be done to improve incentives for investing in the kind of very daunting development programs that are going to be required. We are working, for example, on something we call the Healthspan Act, which is analogous to the Orphan Drug Act. Everybody knows what that did for orphan drugs. But we need a set of sweeping incentives that not only FDA would provide, but ultimately there would be various patent protections that would be modified to compensate for the long periods of time of development for health span indications. So that's a long story, but I think that's just one example of what needs to be done. FDA is well within its ability to handle prevention indications, but they need additional incentives for them to be responsive to sponsors.
What do you think, Alberto?
Thank you. Well, I really like the XPRIZE slogan of healthy aging. And as we've talked before in the community, this involves a paradigm shift. And I think there needs to be more awareness of the meaning of health span and what can it mean for people to have healthy aging. So I think as this becomes more and more disseminated and it becomes more, there's more awareness of this, there might be more inclination to make this shift in the medical establishment.
Bart?
Yeah, so first of all, I think this exercise that you are doing today is already great because you're talking constantly about what are the endpoints to actually get regulatory approval. So I think people were guided pretty well in what to choose as an endpoint. So I think, and in difficult domains like cognition, etc. So that's already important. But from a regulatory side it would be important that we clearly label drugs for what they're meant to do. And this is something that in the European space, at least, is rather difficult. So, for example, with ongoing procedures such as anti-diabetic drugs, they were already mentioned today, the GLP-1 agonists. You get the impression they are good for weight control, for diabetes control, but in Europe they don't get a separate label for preventing cardiovascular disease. Now then it becomes difficult to incentivize someone to develop in that area. So I think as regulators we clearly need to, and I think that what Zen was talking about before, like prioritize not only on orphan drugs but also on drugs that prolong life and with a better quality of life, but that should also lead to a label that's clear for a lay audience. And that would be very important, that we already think about it now, how we will formulate such label.
I did want to switch a little bit to talking about IRBs, institutional review boards, and we had a lot of comments in the public comment period regarding how we are going to handle the requirement for each team to have institutional review board approval, because we are dealing with a global competition, and obviously there are very different regulatory issues in the different countries. So I don't know if there's somebody who can particularly address that, or if you all want to address that. Alberto, you want to?
Thank you. Yeah, I can take this question. So IRBs are a cornerstone of ethics in clinical research. We need to remind ourselves what is the purpose of the IRBs, which is usually protect the patients, their welfare, and the risk-benefits assessment. Usually, most countries have guidelines about how IRBs and clinical research should be conducted, and so we expect teams to abide by these local or national guidelines. In the strange case that there's not a strong component in legislation, teams should also look for IRBs that follow the main principles of clinical research, which are, for example, anchored in the Helsinki Declaration or in the principles of bioethics, such as autonomy, beneficence, and justice, which are all meant, again, to protect patients and especially their privacy. So I think that, this should apply, and there's another criteria that IRBs should be independent and they should be free to exert their oversight without influence from the teams.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
I think one important distinction that is worth making, and that is that all human investigation requires ethical review, IRB or ethical review committee review, not necessarily regulatory review. There are a lot of studies that are done with even drugs that do not require FDA approval. I'm not sure what the situation is in the EU, but if you do not have commercial intent, you can, for example, do a metformin trial, like NIR is proposing to do. And that does not necessarily require FDA approval. However, if you're seeking an indication, then that would generally require that you be doing the study in some ways under IND.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts?
Yeah,
Bart,
maybe
on that?
just to put some good news forward. In Europe, we have the clinical trial regulation that took effect on the 31st of January 2022, and which is trying to really overcome, because we realized that in Europe we were getting behind because of the different countries in terms of clinical research. And so now what you do when you apply for a clinical trial, you apply in a central information system that's managed by EMA, but then dispatched back to the member states. But so there is a centralization actually of how to apply for an IRB. It's as well true that you can do no human research without having applied for an IRB, and especially if you would seek an indication, it's always better to talk to the regulator. You're not obliged to, as in the US, but it's always better to talk to the regulator rather sooner than later. And there is a scientific advice procedures, etc., in place to do so, so that they can already guide you in terms of what they feel is important.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I did have one more question from the public comment that I wanted to have before we open it up to general questions from the audience. There seems to be kind of a public perception that we have a billionaire problem, I would call it, with longevity research and gerotherapeutics. So is this something that we should address more directly with our competition? How do we make this, kind of equitable? Because we certainly want these treatments to be available to everybody from every walk of life. So,
can I just step in here? Yeah, because I have seen a bit the same debate in obesity treatment. So the point is that with some diseases that are not, and with some conditions that are not seen as a disease or something that should be somehow regulated by instances such as the European Medicine Agency, there is this public idea that that should not be regulated by them. I think it is very important that that image should be changed. There is a real reason in improving people's quality of life when they're aging. It becomes a real element of doing, of what we are here to do, basically as doctors. Moving from a cure to prevention is absolutely logic. We became better at curing, but we're still very bad at preventing. So I think that shift in mindset, also in the public mind, is really important to have people understand why we're pouring money into this. And so I think as an organization, it would be important to already attack that issue.
And I second that, and you can see many examples. For example, with the COVID vaccines, their prices were pretty high. And also with diabetes and insulin, we still have very high prices in the US with semaglutide and GLP-1 inhibitors. We also have high prices, so that's definitely a trend. One issue that can be addressed in the competition is the scalability of therapies. In my view, if therapies are very complex based on biologicals or gene therapy, for example, that may make the prices very high. We have, for example, gene therapies that are above $1 million per patient, which are not accessible at the moment. So as these compounds are scalable and can reach a broader population, there might be a space for having a debate about lowering costs and make this available for the most.
Any ideas how to do that? Or is that another discussion?
Yeah, that remains to be seen, and I think it's a conversation to have with the participants.
Okay.
Well, I do think ultimately the solution is evidence that the intervention is effective and is safe. And that will ultimately be the way that products are made available to people, even if they are expensive relatively. But as is even happening in this explosive environment with the GLP-1 agonist, we're starting to see reimbursement for these products for weight loss per se, not for other disease indications. So progress is in the right direction there. But what will save the day is just what XPRIZE is trying to do, and that is to get the evidence to support products that help.
Good. Well, I'm glad we're going in the right direction at least. So that's great. And I did just want to open it up to the audience to see if there are any questions. And could we get a microphone? Thank you, Jeff.
Thomas, sir, from the Catalyst Institute, and this is a question on behalf of people in the audience who are thinking of applying for the prize. So XPRIZE's endpoints are in 3 areas, and the endpoints are not regulatory endpoints, but they are going to have to do clinical proof of concept and so forth. I don't know how it goes, Bart, in Europe, but in the US, that applicants are not going to file for 3 different INDs, one in neuro, one in muscle, and one in immune function. So what advice does this panel have for how applicants should be thinking about the regulatory strategy to enable them to compete for the prize, understanding that that's not the end point. They're not trying to get to market right now. They're trying to qualify for the prize.
Zan, do you want to try that one?
Well, I think it would start with approaching the division which would have the expertise in your sort of lead activity, one of the 3 domains. If you feel like you have more of a play on immune function, you would go with that division for taking the lead. But again, you would, at FDA, have multiple divisions involved to help along the development program. If it's sort of a jump ball, it would go to my former division in all probability, because that traditionally has been the division that took on novel endpoints where it was not a well-defined pathway. I'm hoping that will change, that it will become very clear that there will be very smooth regulatory procedures for getting the information and the help that you need.
Question here. So this timeline for the prize, I think, we've talked about how to demonstrate efficacy, to discuss regulatory ethics, but I don't think we have the time enough to determine safety. The question is, it's only a year, and often in this situation, how will you determine the safety component, because there's no preclinical requirement of demonstration of safety in the prize part, and then as long as you get IRB approval, regulatory approval, you can go in, but a trial of 1 year is not going to tell you a long-term safety for these products.
Well, that is true for new molecular entities, but of course, we're talking about a whole spectrum of modalities.
Right, but the NCEs are not excluded.
Yeah,
so.
That's right, but it's an important point that XPRIZE is covering not just pharmaceutical agents, but even medical devices, nutritional agents. So I think that's a particularly good thing. We're not just talking about drugs, but certainly we are focused on drugs in this conference.
And we are hoping that the run-up period to the final year-long competition will be the time period when the safety issues are certainly going to be addressed as well. So,
just intervene here as well. At the time of marketing authorization, with a lot of drugs, there is of course the benefit, there is the known risks, but there is also the uncertainties. So I think you have always the fact that you have uncertainties, but as long as you can show that you can monitor those uncertainties to get a better view on safety in the more long term, that might not be such a big problem.
Yeah, and to some extent, I would also wonder whether it's feasible to follow the patients or the participants throughout the whole duration of the prize, and especially in the end, and report on any side effects. But this is always a question of whether the benefits will exceed the risks, and I think every team will have to make these calculations. But it's definitely a concern to have in mind.
But I think that someone going for the prize, so to say, should think about these risk minimization measures in the long term. And so if you have a good package of that, I think it wouldn't preclude an approval.
issues, yeah.
Well, another feature that could come into play is a so-called conditional or accelerated approval. This is done all the time, particularly for cancer therapies. And it's done on the basis typically of biomarkers or intermediate clinical endpoints. And that is something that could be done if you were to follow the model that the Center for Veterinary Medicine at FDA is following. They're not requiring that the indication be serious, that is immediately life-threatening, though we could say that ultimately the aging process is life-threatening. But right now, FDA would probably not give it a conditional approval for a healthspan indication unless it has some element of improving survival. And if you take Nir Barzilay's composite for the TAME trial, I would say that if you demonstrate the reduction of risk across multiple chronic diseases, that indeed would be addressing eminently serious disease and should be subject to an accelerated approval. But metformin has the advantage of obviously having a great deal of worldwide experience. The issue really comes into play when there's a new molecular entity.
Great.
Yeah, this question is about the safety aspect of the application, and I think it's primarily for Dr. Goetz. Dr. Goetz, you said that you expect to see a risk minimization plan in the application, in addition to a data and safety monitoring plan and a plan for physician oversight. I don't think I saw any details about what a risk minimization plan would be in the guidelines. So I wonder if you could just clarify what you're looking for.
Sure. It's pretty standard for a lot of the protocols that you put in for clinical trials to just address each and every one of the risks and the level of risk that it would be. So if it's a minimum risk, obviously something like a blood draw, or if it's something like an emotional risk just from having the stress of going through the process. So there's a part of an IRB protocol that should have the risks minimized section. And certainly there are plenty of examples and protocols that are available online, but the NIH has a lot of them that just go through the kind of the minimum number of steps that have been taken to address each and every one of the risks that are going to be happening with this protocol, and say what is being done to do, to minimize those risks.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. First, Tom Rafai in Detroit and Cleveland Clinic. We're talking a lot about FDA approval here, but ultimately XPRIZE is interested in a scalable solution that is going to obviously be reasonably cost-friendly, by definition scalable. When we have a lifestyle intervention, for instance, and combined with metformin therapy, for instance, we're interested in getting the product in the combination reimbursed, but we're not necessarily shooting for FDA approval. We'll let NIR figure that part out with the metformin. Is this a requirement that whatever the solution is, as long as it's scalable, gets FDA approval? Because to get reimbursement, we won't necessarily need FDA approval, just like the Diabetes Prevention Program is covered by many insurances in the United States if they have a YMCA or otherwise. But it's not, the DPP is not FDA approved per se.
It is not a requirement for your intervention to get FDA approval, depending on what the intervention is, obviously, so correct.
Okay. The other thing I guess I'll mention as a metformin fan, please monitor your patients for vitamin B12, and we can discuss some other issues as well.
No, just to comment that the B12, what happened with metformin, B12 is going intracellularly. There's no B12 deficiency. That's why it's not recommended to, I know, but it's not real.
Would you two like to have a debate?
Any other questions from the audience?
Over there.
I may be naive here, but I just wanted to hear more about the Healthspan Act that was referenced earlier. And just
The Healthspan Act.
Oh, well, it's a work in progress, but I think you will be hearing about it in the next several months. We hope to have a session in our Targeting Healthy Longevity conference series. And we do engage FDA and other stakeholders in these kind of conferences, and would hope to make this more tangible and have immediate effects. So it's not going to happen overnight, as legislation typically goes, but I think this is something that should be a bipartisan effort that should not be controversial.
Great. Any other questions? I know Jamie had not wanted us to get into a discussion of whether or not aging should be a disease, but when you mentioned the Healthspan Act, is that part of that, whether or not aging should be a disease? So, and I hope Jamie doesn't hate me for bringing that up.
Well, it's a great question, because there continues to be this assumption that you need to have a disease target to get FDA to approve the indication or the new product. That's not true. I don't think that that's really a problem for FDA. FDA approves plenty of primary or secondary prevention indications. It may be an issue for payers, and of course that's something that varies from region to region, but FDA itself doesn't have any problem with prevention indications.
And I think that opens an interesting point of how to establish more relationships or debates between the FDA and regulatory authorities and actors in the longevity community. I'm very interested in how this question of the aging as an indication gets asked over and over, even in the scientific literature. And I think to some extent it relates to a narrow framing of how regulation works or what regulation is for. So I think one avenue to address this is to have more open conversations on the topic and get a wider, diverse range of stakeholders involved in this, not only in regulation, but also in legislation, as many groups are already doing. For example, the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, understanding, as I mentioned in the beginning, that this is a shift towards health span that takes plenty of work in many areas to succeed, not only in the scientific space, but also in the social, in the media, and in other realms.
Any comments?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on aging as a disease, but I think at least where I'm an expert is obesity, and I can see that for obesity, the fact that some people don't recognize it as a disease has long time prevented investment in the field, and is now also making very convoluted the implementation of very efficacious treatments, notably by payers. So it's an unhelpful discussion, I think, but if you look at the definition of disease according to the World Health Organization and then look at aging, and especially when aging goes wrong, is diminishing the quality of life of people, making them unable to do social activities, etc., then it has all the characteristics of a disease. And so, in the sense, if you want to call it a disease or not, it's a semantic discussion, but that there needs to be development in preventing the negative sides of aging appearing, there I think we can all agree on.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any other? Here?
Just for the aging disease, look, the pushback is from our clients. They don't want to be called sick. What, you're 60 years old and you're sick? Look what happened in COVID. We isolated them, we threw them to islands, we didn't visit them, right? There's a lot of social activists in aging that are absolutely against us. On the other hand, when we sat with the FDA about the TAME trial, okay, we didn't call that aging, they didn't accept it aging, but if we have something that prevents multimorbidities of aging, they're fine. So there's no practical reason now to do that, and we have to kind of work with our people.
Yeah, I think go ahead.
Yeah, and maybe we can all work together to perhaps create a new term or a new category of what it means to age well or healthy aging. Because I think that's something that everybody can get on board. I agree with Nir's comment that aging can be sometimes seen as a stigma, and that of course raises certain suspicion and skepticism about the community. But I think in the end, everybody wants to live well as much as they can, and I think we don't have a good term for this.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question if anybody has one.
Hi, Mr. Flynn, the Yorkslow. Is that not a reason to think more about developing dietary supplements to address this issue? Because at least in Europe, dietary supplements can be used to improve function, so improve muscle function, improve cognition, and then you address all of these issues.
Well, where's the evidence? That's the problem. There just is not the commercial incentive to do the kind of studies for dietary supplements. We don't have long-term evidence of not only effectiveness, but safety.
But that's what we're going to do in this XPRIZE, aren't we?
Well, yeah, but, well, that nutrients or nutritional products should be included, but they should have the same kind of evidence that a pharmacologic agent should have to win the prize and to be approved.
And I think we do have some people entering with supplements, so there should be good data at the end. So, all right, well, I just want, just one more question, comment?
Aren't there several RCTs with, I'm going to mention a product, I hate to say it, but with Centrum? I mean, there have been randomized controlled
Well,
trials.
that is true. Centrum has actually shown some improvement in cognitive function. Now, that's not necessarily a disease-modifying effect, but that is exceptional. There's also the product Cocavia, a flavanol, which had a large randomized control trial and came very close to showing a benefit on reducing CV risk. They maintain that if everybody had been more adherent to the assigned treatment, that it would have been a positive trial. But these are the unicorns in the dietary supplement space.
Any quick comment about Vital, with the vitamin D and omega-3, randomized controlled trial?
For what?
Vitamin D3 and omega-3, Omacor, randomized controlled trial.
I'm not familiar with the data.
VITAL.
Okay.
I'll send you some.
All right. Well, I just want to thank our panelists, Bart, Alberto, and Zan. So thank you very much for your expertise.